We play chess on a square board that has 64 squares, so that's 8 times 8. We have light colored squares and dark colored squares. Typically we'll call them white and black squares, but they can have any color. We need to place the board so that the lower right square is a light square. So pay attention, if you rotate the board 90 degrees, you will end up with a dark square on the lower right corner, and that's not good. We play with different types of pieces: pawn, knight, bishop, rook, queen, and king. At the beginning of the game, each player has 8 pawns, 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a queen, and a king. 8 pawns, 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a queen, and a king. It's important to note that the white queen is on a white square and the black queen on a black square. So pay attention not to interrupt the order of queen and king. We're playing with different pieces which have different values. If we say that a pawn has a value of 1, a knight would have a value of 3 pawns. A bishop would have a value of 3 pawns also. A rook would have a value 5 pawns. The queen has a value of 9 pawns. The king has no value because you cannot play without your king, so even though it's not the most powerful piece, it's a necessary piece. Therefore you could argue that its value is infinite. The rook goes in straight lines, any number of squares and in any direction. The bishop goes diagonally, any number of squares in any direction. The queen, like a rook, in straight lines, any number of squares in any direction. And like a bishop, diagonally, any number of squares in any direction. It's the most powerful piece on the chessboard. The king goes 1 square in any direction. The knight is a bit special. He goes in a L shape. 2 squares, turn left. 2 squares, turn right. You see the pattern. 2 squares straight, turn left, and 2 squares straight, turn right. Two squares straight, turn left from the point of view of the knight, and 2 squares, turn right. And last, 2 squares, turn left, 2 squares, turn right. So here you can see which squares are controlled by the knight. Once again, 2 squares, turn left, 2 squares, turn right. 2 squares straight, turn left, 2 squares straight, turn right. Again, 2 squares, turn left, 2 squares, turn right. 2 squares, turn left, 2 squares, turn right. Here we see that the knight controls a maximum of 8 squares. The pawn goes 1 square forward only, in straight lines. The pawn cannot go backwards. Of course, black's pawns go in the opposite direction. Here we can see how the rook goes, and if there is an enemy piece in the path of the rook can capture it. Here, the white rook can capture the black pawn or the black knight. One important rule: we cannot capture over other pieces. So here, the white rook can capture the black pawn, but not the bishop, because the bishop is behind the pawn. And the white rook can capture the knight. But let's suppose there's another black knight, and there's one of our white pieces. Here, the rook cannot capture the knight, because there is a piece in front of it. And of course, we cannot capture our own pieces. Here, the bishop can take the white rook or the white knight. But if there were another piece in front, in the path of the bishop, then the situation changes. Here, the black bishop cannot capture the white rook anymore, but can capture the pawn. Again, if there is a black piece in the path, the black bishop cannot capture the knight anymore. We saw that the knight has a special way of moving. The knight is very special because it's the only piece that can jump over other pieces, over its own pieces or enemy pieces. In this position, the knight can go here, here. Again, 2 squares turn left, 2 squares turn right. 2 squares turn left, 2 squares turn right. But the knight can also jump over other pieces. 2 squares turn right, 2 squares turn left. So knight is efficient even if there are other pieces in the way. Our own pieces or enemy pieces, it doesn't matter. So here, for example, the knight can capture the bishop. The knight doesn't take anything that's on the path, just on the last square. So here, the knight cannot take the black pawn and also cannot take the black queen, but can take the bishop. So the pieces take the same way as they move. If it finds an enemy piece in its path, it can take it, and only the knight can jump over other pieces. And here we have a special case for the pawn. We have seen that the pawn goes only in straight lines forward, 1 square, and the pawn cannot go backward. That's the only piece that cannot go backward. So that's forbidden. But that's the only piece that doesn't take the same way as it moves. Here, the white pawn goes forward 1 square, but takes diagonally 1 square. In this case, if we have 3 enemy pieces, the pawn cannot capture the bishop. The pawn is blocked by the bishop, he cannot advance, but the pawn can take the knight or the rook. If the pawn has not moved yet, he is allowed to move 2 squares. So this pawn can move either 1 square or 2 squares forward. And that's only for the first move. This pawn can choose to move 1 square or 2. And after that, it can move only 1 square forward. And capture diagonally, of course. That's the same for any other pawn. We can play it 1 square or 2. Again, same for black pieces, here or here. 1 square or 2 squares. 1 square or 2 squares. Also, in a game of chess, the player that has the white pieces plays first. The squares have names, and this allows us to describe a chess game. Write it down. If we're talking about the A pawn, it will be this one. It's on the A file. If we are talking about the H pawn, that will be this one. Of course, sometimes we have several possibilities. If we talk about E pawn, there are 2 pawns on the E file. So one will be the E3 pawn, the other one the E5 pawn. So if we say, for example, that white plays C7, this is C7. This is the A1 square. This is the H8 square. We have seen that the pawns move forward, 1 square at a time, except for the first move, of course. And once a pawn has reached the end of the board, we have to promote it to another piece, which means we have to change it to another piece. Here, white plays, black plays, and here, white can choose between 4 pieces: knight, bishop, rook, or queen, even if we already have those pieces on the board. Of course, the queen is the most powerful piece, so most of the time we will choose a queen. Later we will see some cases when we have to under-promote to another piece. Another special case for the pawns. We know that the pawn takes diagonally. Here in this position, if white plays his pawn, 1 square, black can take the pawn. Now we know that at the beginning we can choose to move a pawn 1 square or 2 squares. The interesting thing here is that even if we move this pawn 2 squares forward, black is allowed to take the white pawn as if it had moved only 1 square. So it takes here. You see? That's called en passant. That's just valid for the first pawn move. So only if the pawn moves 2 squares forward. Let's see this again. If we move a pawn 2 squares forward, and if there is an enemy pawn next to us, the enemy pawn can take us en passant, as if we had moved 1 square only. This works only if we are moving 2 squares at once. In this case, the white pawn has moved 1 square forward, and if now it moves another square, we cannot take en passant. And the last specific move, we can take king, move it 2 squares to the right, and put the rook next to the king. That's castling. Black can do the same thing. Black has castled. White can also castle on the other side, also 2 squares, and the rook next to it. This is a long castle. We see here that the king and the rook are separated by 2 squares, whereas on the other side they are separated by 3 squares. That's why we're talking about short castling and long castling. As you guessed, this is short castling, and this is long castling. You can only castle if the king and the rook have not moved yet. Another important rule, the king dare not go through a square that is attacked by the enemy. For example, here, the black queen attacks the d1 square, so white cannot castle long, but he can castle on the short side. White is attacking the f8 square, so black cannot castle short, but can castle long. Here we see that the white rook attacks the black bishop and the black king. When the king is attacked, we say that he is in check. And one important rule is that the king dare not remain in check. As soon as the black king is attacked, he has to get out of check. He'll have to move out of the attack from the rook. So you cannot remain in check. We already know that the king goes one square in any direction. So this is where the black king can play. Now, if white plays the rook here, we see that the rook is attacking the king. So the black king is in check. We know that the king dare not remain in check. So the king has to get out of check. The problem here is that the other rook attacks all these squares, and you see that the black king has nowhere to escape. We say that the black king is checkmated. That's the aim of the game, to checkmate the opponent's king. And here white has won the game. And this does not depend on how many pieces white and black have on the board. If you are in checkmate, you lose the game.